Yeah, experiment. So I'm Harrison Pratt. I'm a Chico and Butte County local. I am trying to put together podcasts where we can explore how American policies intersect with our local community and how we can work through activism to actually affect change that we want to see in our community. So that's what this is supposed to be, a platform for activism and people to get the message out, especially in a time of COVID-19 where we're not supposed to be in large groups like we've been out on the streets lately. So that being said, Kate, you want to introduce yourself since you're up
Sure.
front right now?
My name's Kate Wright. I am also a Butte County local. I grew up in Berry Creek, Orville, have lived in Chico. I was exposed to grassroots activism at a very young age and have just been trying to make my way in the world with all the nonsense. I've been exposed to. I've been part of the local ban on fracking, an advocate for public banking, and I hosted a poetry circle, really precious poetry circle in the community for years. Was a freelance correspondent for one of the local newspapers for a bit too. Don't have many other credentials to offer, but I've been trying to be involved and excited for something like this for a long time. I just didn't want to take it up on my own, so I'm excited to be here.
John?
My name is John Lapine, and I am not a local. I moved here to Chico about 2 years ago, and I moved because I got the job teaching at Butte College. So I'm a teacher. I teach in the English department, and that includes kind of a lot of different subjects, composition, research, source analysis, that kind of stuff, as well as teaching critical thinking and also journalism, which was my minor as my undergrad. So I had a little bit of experience on the academic side of journalism, and now I'm also teaching journalism. I never really worked as a journalist, but also teach things like poetry, literature, um, film and lit, things like that. So it's interesting, Kate. It feels like you bring the activism side. You're like, I don't really have that many credentials, and I feel like all I have is like baseless credentials in academia. As far as activism, I'm not. I guess I should say I haven't been super involved in grassroots activism, but I believe in a lot of what grassroots activists are doing and saying, and the causes that they're fighting for. Even though I haven't necessarily been like man on the ground, so to speak.
Well, I can tell you one thing. For my part, I feel like you showed us milk in that class, and you're exposing a lot of young kids to the concept of grassroots activism. So maybe you might not be participating in it, but that's probably part of where I'm coming from with this whole thing. So I'm like, man, you know, like, yeah, you're a good educator. That's all I can really say.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah,
For sure.
that was fall of 2018, and part of the
Mm.
thing that I did in teaching that class, this critical thinking class, was really base it in part California politics, because that was something that I didn't really have a lot of experience. Growing up in Michigan, there's a lot of these like stereotypes about what California is and what it looks like, and um, people are like, "Oh, you're going to learn how to surf when you move there, or you're going to meet a celebrity," and I'm like, "It's not that kind of California, honey. It's a different kind of California."
Northern California, it's a whole different thing.
Yeah, which is definitely its own like set of politics. It's interesting that we're living in a county that is red in a state that is kind of historically blue, and what does that say for your vote? But part of the reason that I taught that class with this framework of California politics specifically is because I wanted to learn more about it and kind of the history. And one thing that I think that I learned is, some of these characters that show up in the book, they're not really characters, they're real life people. But I thought this book called State of Resistance, and it's
Yeah.
talking about the history of Jerry Brown and how he's kind of been this establishment politician forever, and Feinstein as well, and these people that you've known since 70s, 80s, 90s who are still in power today. And that was something that was kind of revealed to me as I was teaching this class and interacting with students who have been here for a while and kind of getting their perspectives too.
It's interesting with Jerry Brown because I read that book in your class, but that was right after I had gotten out of prison, and Jerry Brown had his second round as governor, and during that time he pushed Prop 57, which was a law that was supposed to correct a lot of the mistakes that he made in his prior administration in passing the three strikes law and becoming more aggressive about mass incarceration. And now we're at a situation where our inmate population has gotten so big that the Supreme Court, the conservative Supreme Court of the United States, slapped California and said, hey, you can't incarcerate this many people. You just can't. It's inhumane. And so they had to go in and make all of these time credit issues and kind of work to extend people time credits so that they could get released for nonviolent crimes. And it's really interesting because in spite of all that, there was a massive pushback from the CO's union and all of these other, all the prosecutors across the state were like, oh, you're just going to let violent criminals out to the thing, when it's literally only nonviolent crimes that you can even get Prop 57 credits for. And yeah, that was an interesting situation because I'm kind of in that camp where I'm like, hey, I really appreciate you fixing your mistake, but it's still your mistake. So I'm not personally fond of Jerry Brown that much because it's like, so
he got you into this mess and now he's trying to get you out, but
in a sense,
how can you trust? Yeah.
Well, and then it's just a situation where you realize it's kind of an insider's perspective, a real insider's perspective on how the politics in California works. You know what I mean? Because you think about it, the police unions are the strongest lobbying organizations in California. And so, the officers union, the CO's union, every single one of these people is pulling a $100,000 plus salary off of incarcerating people, So that's a massive conflict of interest. And then if you think that they're a lobbying organization, they do that by creating campaign contributions to all of our politics. And that's why in such a blue state, we still incarcerate, not per capita at a higher level than anybody else, but we have more inmates than any other place in the world right here in California, So
Harrison, you can, from your firsthand experience, I'm sure you have so many stories, but I have a friend, an activist friend, who's also from Michigan, John, and Isaac has become a local, went to Chico State. He was president of the Chico Peace and Justice Center. I'm sure we'll have him on at some point, but Isaac looped me into AVP, which is Alternative Violence Program, and folks like ourselves, anyone who's interested, can volunteer, and we go up to a prison. So we went to a high desert prison in Susanville. And even if you were locked up for a nonviolent crime that maybe would have qualified for Prop 57, the prison system socially is set up to keep you in there. You're constantly watching your back. You're prompted to fight. And I don't want to elaborate because I heard personal stories, but it was heartbreaking and eye-opening. And I came to care about the folks I met in there, of course. And I was rooting for some folks who were saying, I'm going to be out in a few months. And I checked back and it's like something happened. There was a fight on the yard and now 6 more years. It's like, even if you could have qualified, the system there is going to keep you coming back.
It's not just that, it's you have internal groups. It's an interesting situation because what you have is a totalitarian fascist structure. You know what I mean? Like you have an extreme, like right-wing group of individuals controlling every movement, controlling everything about your life, and their job, their all day, every day is about control of people. But,
well, and I would say people on the outside, when folks are thinking about prisons and they hear the word control, that translates to safety, in the general public, which is why that illusion is so powerful. Because why do we still have the prison industrial complex because people think we need it. People think that's how we stay safe, and people aren't considering all of the factors that, besides poverty, besides historical like redlining that has led to segregated neighborhoods, that once you're even in prison, this idea of control is actually manipulation and pushes you towards you're uncomfortable, you're working really hard, you're getting paid nothing.
Yeah, I got
Next to nothing.
I was paid 11 cents an hour to work in the kitchen. And the only
Yeah.
reason I didn't end up on a fire crew where you're risking your life cutting down trees in fires like the Paradise fire was because I went in with an injury. You know what I mean? So like if I
11 cents an hour for a $2 packet of top ramen. Like,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly, precisely. So it's one of these situations where it's like, so if you think about it from the context, you know, we're a capitalist society. Now, we don't think about prisons in the sense of being a business. You know what I mean?
We don't want
Because,
to, right?
well, it's not just that. We think of it as government institution, right? So
Right.
that's inherently not a business, but we've literally privatized it. We have corporate prisons and things like that. But then if you even get into California, California supposedly banned for-profit prisons, right? Well, that's kind of subterfuge because we still outsource our inmates. Every level 3 inmate in California, since all of the level 3 yards inside of California are full beyond capacity, we send our inmates to Arizona. We send our inmates to Mississippi.
Huh.
There's Butte County boys like the guy that I was in reception with. He went to Arizona. You know, he was serving a 10-year sentence. He went to a level 3 yard in Arizona, which is a private corporation owned by, I think they used to be called CCA. And then, yeah, you know, they pay their employees $15 an hour to do a job that the cops in California get paid $150,000 a year. You know, they're Walmart affecting the prison industry. But right here in California, we supposedly ban that. So instead, we outsource our inmates to that system, and then within our California prisons to make a phone call. You know, in Butte County Jail, you have to go through securus.net. Those phone calls cost $9 for a 15-minute phone call. And
So you get one chance to attempt, and if your friend on the other line, your family member, doesn't pick up, there's your chance, and you still have to pay the money.
Well, and then, yeah, so communication with your family, you have to go through a corporation and pay them, you know, outrageous sums of money just to talk. They service the yard with catalogs. So anything you can buy at Walmart, your family can send in. So it's like, not only are they taking you out of the workforce where you could earn money that goes back into the community, but then in order to keep your quality of life anything but miserable, your family has to spend exorbitant amounts of money, you know, sending you in a package every couple of months and then putting money on your books so that you can pay to the in-house store. You know what I mean? So even in the
Whoa.
Yeah, so even inside the government facilities that aren't technically for profit, they still are, you know, making corporations massive profits. Well, the first catalog company was created by a sheriff's department. That's the police. They said, hey, you know, we can make money off of these guys. And then on top of that, California saves what, $50, $60 an hour using inmates to fight fires as opposed to actually sending our firefighters out there, you know? So
I think it's easy for us to think that something that's government run is maybe divorced from profit making, right? Like, oh, if it's the government, they're not trying to turn a profit. It's the government doing the government things, and corporations are separate and they do corporate things. But here, there's this place where there's an intersection, and probably not for the best, right? Something I think you said, Kate, that's really important is I think just the human side of these stories. Like you said, that we have this idea of control as being equivalent to safety. Like if prison guards have control, then we as a general public are kind of safer for that. And I think that these recent calls to defund the police or even abolition of police, I think that's the first question that kind of comes up for a lot of people is like, well, then how are we going to be safe? then what do we do if we need the cops? And I've been reading a lot of anecdotes, which maybe not the best example, but I've heard, there's tons and tons of stories about people calling the police and the police don't help. I mean, a personal story for me is really minor, but I was hit by a car on my bike, and we were both at fault. I was they weren't looking out, and I was maybe not biking in the safest way. But the driver of the car took it to police, and then a couple days later, I went to the police, and they said, "Oh yeah, that sounds familiar. Let's pull up the thing." And it turns out that the vehicle that had hit me was a municipal vehicle, and it had a dash cam. And I asked if they'd like gotten the dash cam, and they're like, "No, we didn't take a copy of it." And it's like, what am I paying you guys for?
Yeah.
If there's dash cam footage of. I don't think that he stopped at a stop sign is what happened, and I was on the wrong side. I was in the sidewalk, but not on the side that the bikes were supposed to be on. But he didn't stop at a stop sign, and I asked if I could like see the footage, and they're like, "We don't have it." And I was like, "What do you do?" When you extrapolate that out, kind of maybe more to the national level, we have places where the community already enforces the things that police maybe shouldn't be. Like an example is if you're in the suburbs and you catch your son with weed and he's underage, and you're like, "This is an issue." The cops don't show up. You deal with it yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's what some of the push for defunding the police is. When you take money out of the police system and put it into more community-based things, like programs that are going to reduce crime just by having that program in place, that's maybe a better use of our resources. When a lot of these cities have, 51% of the city budget is to the police. Is that overinflated? Yeah. A lot of people are saying, yeah.
Chico's idea of defunding the police is moving it from 51% of the budget to 49% of the budget.
Right.
Yeah. So we're really progressive.
Well, and I think there's two things that really blow my mind. One is anecdotal, and the other comes from a grand jury report, Butte County, to the fiscal year 2011-2012, that I came across years ago. Really caught my attention. I haven't quite forgot. I'm going to start with the anecdote of my friend who was in a turn lane. She was driving a 35 miles an hour zone, and someone hit her from the back. So they were going, 60. They're like quite fast for the speed limit of the area. And so they hit her from behind. Luckily, she's okay. But when the police came down, they didn't do any even initial investigation. They said that unless someone was intoxicated or killed, that they don't have the capacity to do that. So I don't understand why in the first place are we paying you for this, or why are you using money from the police budget and you're not fulfilling the roles that we don't have someone else to fulfill in that case. It's like, okay, then why'd you send a cop? Why didn't you fund someone who would do the investigation, who would take photos of the skid marks? And I don't even know what else they could do, but there wasn't action, and there wasn't another phone number to call to have a civil servant provide that service. My friend ended up taking a 50-50 bargain, which that passes on the cost to the citizens because the work didn't get done. And so going to the grand jury report, because there's an idea I want to tie here, which this grand jury report was responded to by a Butte County sheriff also, and there's public documentation of his response going through their itemized lists of their findings. And they categorized the response with agree, disagree, partially agree. And this piece was, there are not enough services to handle drug and alcohol abuse problems for people who have been inside and have now been returned to the general public. And that is a huge cause of recidivism. Excuse me. Yeah. And we haven't seen increased funding. We haven't seen increased programs been made available to help people with this clearly identified issue, that these programs not being made available, because there are some programs available while you're inside jail or the prison to help with that, but they need to be continued. Otherwise, you're cut off, and yes, maybe you're free, but you haven't had enough internal work, physiological help. So the connected piece is, the cops, they're getting funded. So why, when there's very specific issues to be addressed, why hasn't the money gone there
I could
to do their job?
probably make a guess, and that's because business is good. You know what I
This
mean?
is good, and the priorities aren't our actual safety and our actual protection.
Yeah.
Is my
Well, so the cops themselves, the guys who are running the institution, will tell you every single day, thank God you guys are out there committing crimes because it makes me able to make $170,000 sitting on my ass in this human suit. That's a literal quote that somebody said to me in there. So when I was up for before the parole board, there is a couple of programs, and they're really good programs in Butte County specifically, and they're pilot programs. So there's something called the MCRP, the Men's Community Reintegration Program. And so they took over Tri-County's treatment, which is a drug rehab in Oroville, and now they exclusively house active inmates. So I spent 24 months in state prison, and the last 60 days of it I spent in a rehab where, you know, you spend the first 30 to 60 days doing, you know, stuff like anger management, parenting classes, substance abuse classes. You slowly work out into the community, are able to get a job. So actually, believe it or not, Butte County is at the forefront of that, and that was a program instituted by Jerry Brown in the Prop 57.
nice.
It's a pretty big law, but
Yeah, they weren't saying that there are no programs, but they were saying that there are not enough, and that is a huge cause.
Correct. So that should be universal, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, those programs would be a better option for incarceration in the first place because not only are they cheaper, the average inmate costs the taxpayers, I believe, but this is an old study, mind you. This is while I was still incarcerated. I read in the San Quentin's Time that it costs $67,000 per inmate, and that's you know, per capita basis. But the reality is if a guy goes in there with terminal cancer, he's going to be costing the state $300,000 a year easily. You know what I mean? And so those are real issues. You know, on top of that, again, you're taking a working adult out of the labor force and having their families spend thousands upon thousands of dollars just straight into the incarceration system, out of their community into the system, right? Now, you translate that over to the residential treatment idea or the MCRP program that they're doing. It costs an average of $12,000 a year because they're paying a small staff, maybe one or two officers that live in the facility, not live, but work, you know, 12-hour shifts inside the facility. You're still monitored by the police, but instead of guards watching you all day, you have counselors and, you know, drug rehab counselors that are, I mean, I was really fortunate because one of my cousins actually works at the NCRP. So the last 2 months I got to see family. You know what I mean? That was a blessing. You have no idea. But like those programs only cost us, you know, maybe 20% of what incarcerating that same person will. But then that money pays people that live in the community, and that money goes back out into the community. You buy, you know, you buy food for these people, and instead of it coming on a truck from some government facility with boxes that say not for human consumption, which is what we get fed inside, they go to Costco, spend money, or they go to Winco and spend money at, you know, the local businesses, and so that money goes out and creates a multiplier effect within the community. You're also employing community members to do something positive for inmates as opposed to cops to, you know, control and traumatize inmates, because let's be real, that's what it actually is, you know.
And I think a lot of that rests on the narrative of like good versus evil that we, I think, tend to subscribe to, because that's kind of the easy answer of like, why is there crime? Why do bad things happen? Well, some people are just evil or they're bad, right? And
Absolutely.
that false dichotomy doesn't really leave any room for a redemption story, right? Someone who did a bad thing and they're still a good person is not really factored into, I think, what a lot of people think of as like the black versus white, good versus evil. even like immediate cause and then immediate effect. You say, well, if you put in this program and then something bad happens right afterwards, then you got to get rid of that program entirely without seeing that as like a part of the process. If that makes sense. I'm thinking about like the needle exchange program,
Yeah.
in Chico, or the syringe access program, which my hometown also started. And I was back there for Christmas, and it's a tiny little 20,000 person town with not a really big homeless problem, or unhoused persons, because it's really cold in Michigan and people don't want to live there. Um, but the owners of this restaurant had a poster for syringe access program as well, and you see so many people who are kind of actively speaking out against that,
Yeah.
in Chico and in Butte County, because I guess they don't believe in that redemption story. You know, that we've all this research that suggests that this is a way through, but I think the narrative that people really subscribe to, because it's the easy one, is drug addicts are bad. They made a choice. Addiction is a choice. Instead of looking at how would someone even get to that place in their life. You know, what are the systems in place that have encouraged this person in one way or another to make a choice that maybe you consider bad.
Yeah. I've had a lot of experience with that community, to be honest. And, you know, from my perspective, so I became a drug addict in my mid 20s. And it was not street drugs, it was not anything like that. I didn't smoke pot and then move to heroin. I got an injury. I was in a car accident when I was 19. It misaligned my sacrum from my tailbone and caused me to start having sciatica. So every day for the last 20 years, I've had what feels like a lightning bolt shooting down my right leg 24/7. And so a couple of years into all this, I went to the doctor and he prescribed me that little yellow pill, you know what I mean? So I got Narcos from my doctor and started a 15-year descent into addiction that ultimately landed me in state prison. Now, I had friends that had done meth my entire life because I lived, you know, in a shitty neighborhood in Chico. I grew up in the East of Eden apartments off of East Lassen, which is government housing. So, you know, I was in a kind of well-to-do neighborhood, but I was in a slum within the context of that well-to-do neighborhood where, you know, white kids were the minority. It was primarily the most of the population was people that were refugees from asylum seekers from like Central and South America, as well as, you know, Vietnamese, the Hmongs that came over during the Vietnam War and all the unrest. So those were all the people that I grew up around, you know what I mean? So it was kind of an interesting perspective because it was like, oh, you know, it gave me as a white person an insight into being a minority, you know what I mean? So it's kind of just an interesting, that's a side note, but I had friends doing drugs my entire life, and I always avoided it because I saw the pitfalls. And then I went to the doctor and trusted him because of his white lab coat, and then got into drugs. Well, in this community, you have a pharmacy on East Avenue, Walgreens, that's under investigation from the DEA for
To
bringing
right
in.
now, right?
Yeah,
Not while you're growing up, but
absolutely.
right now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, because they're bringing in more opiates than anyone in this town possibly could. They are a pill
Mm-hmm.
mill, you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Like the equivalent of 3,000 opiates per resident of Butte County, right? Something
like
in that neighborhood, which is
per
absurd.
per per year. Yeah, you know, if you total
Okay.
it out per year, it's a ridiculous amount. Well, heroin is extremely prevalent in this community. You know, you don't think the chemists are just going and getting their fills at the pharmacy and producing the heroin that we see on the drugs, bringing fentanyl into it. But once it's a street drug and once people are doing it quote unquote illegally, then what you said, John, it becomes a moral issue. And again, you have this gigantic business that is condoned by the state of California to translate that into slave labor, basically, for all intents and purposes, legalized slave labor as per the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. And so you have them providing the drugs for us. You have a corporation providing the drugs for us. You have our corporate health system prescribing the drugs to us. Um, you have street providers creating more and more and more dangerous and more potent drugs. And then you have the police using that to incarcerate your citizens. You have the media as the advertising front for this system, because we can't just advertise prisons, can we? It's a business, so they need to advertise their services, but they can't just say, hey, support Butte County Jail, because it's a scary institution and we can't run private commercials for government institutions, right? So we have our news, we have our local news, we have our papers, we have online sources broadcasting that, and then we have our religious institutions teaching us this moral parable, and that if you do the wrong things, you deserve to live in hell. And so they've created that hell for us right here. You know what I mean?
I think it's interesting, and John, I'm really glad you brought up our myths of good and evil, because I see this with the support, this kind of layperson support of the capitalist system. What people don't understand is that they have so much control that they're able to create little economies. Like, they create the economy inside the prison system. They're able to create the economy that they're able to set the ground for the creation of the narco economy in the slums, which they created the drugs, they created the slums. And then they get to create the economy of enforcement. And that's all under this guise of good and bad. Like, if you're an individual and you live in capitalist America, if you're good, you're doing everything right and you'll be able to participate. And if you're bad, you're not able to participate, and that's okay. You get to be condemned because you're bad. And there's so much there, cost of entry, wanting to participate, but our illusions really have a lot of arms behind them to keep them in place. The media wants us to support the cops, wants us to believe their doctors have our best interests in mind. And there's just a lot to dismantle, and it's all connected.
Very, very connected. Yes.
I don't need to stay there, but there's power.
I'm just giving that a moment to sink in because it's powerful. It's real. And it even goes further, because if you think about it, so when you're incarcerated, I wouldn't end there, man, thinking, fuck, we're just going to rage against the cops, man, right?
From inside?
Attica, right? You get inside there and there's a whole nother economy inside there that's based on, once again, drugs and contraband. So who controls...
And where does that contraband come from?
Exactly. How does it get into what it's supposed to be, a closed system? Who's going in and out of there every day? Only the cops and the employees. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have employees and the police officers themselves making an extra $5,000 a week, bringing flip phones in for the inmates so that they can, call their people on the outside, get PayPal numbers. Well, yeah. They'll charge an inmate $500 for a phone, and then just kick back, wait a couple of weeks, and then start shaking down cells.
Yeah. And then you have an economy of blackmail. You have an economy of allegiance.
But it's not just that; it's also a system of control. They pick their favorites. Right. You know what I mean? And so, in that way, they can get the white supremacist gangs to fight against the Northerners or fight against the blacks, and they can get this group, the Northerners, to fight against the Southerners or the Paisas and these things. And again, it's that whole concept of divide and conquer. So you have a captive audience that should be raging against the people with guns that are shooting them in the face with pepper spray every day, and instead they work with those guys to try and control the other inmates.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, they create a system where it's really easy to live. I hate to say it, but it's a shitty place and it's like hell on earth, but it's a very simple life. They do your laundry for you. They wake you up and feed you. You know what I mean? So people that don't have necessarily the skills to go get a job, or they don't have the physical appearance that is going to allow them to just walk into a place and get a job that sustains them, they can find a place in there where maybe because I'm violent and rough around the edges, I'll fit in with this group. You know what I mean? And so you have a lot of guys that are like, I'd rather be rich in jail than poor on the street. You know what I mean? So I'm just gonna go plug up with like a bunch of heroin, go get myself locked up. The cops are gonna let that dude in because they know his deal, and they're gonna allow him to move those drugs inside the jail and create that system because he's making them money. They're profiting off of this. They're having a comfortable life because of it, you know? And so that's a real thing, you know? And that translates to the street just the same, you know? This whole white supremacist trend. Why are poor whites so willing to move with the Republican Party? You know what I mean? When they've been screwing them over their entire lives.
And
Well,
with the police. Right. That's
ex-
something that has kind of been freaking me out as on the individual level over the last few weeks, since the George Floyd murder, was I guess the images of police uh, working hand in hand with alt-right groups and white supremacist groups in cities like Philadelphia, which is really racially segregated. Kate mentioned redlining earlier. Philadelphia's a symptom of that. Um, and in Portland, the organizations like the Proud Boys, who are
yeah,
defending Confederate monuments, maybe not in Portland, but groups that are defending Confederate monuments and groups that are alt-right and groups that are known as hate groups and or white supremacist groups, and then seeing them being not attacked by the police. Seeing guys walking around Philly with baseball bats and golf clubs, and
yeah,
acting as this like we're gonna protect our city from rioters, kind of self-appointed militia, and then watching the cops kind of work hand in hand with those people does not really inspire confidence, I guess. One thing that it does not inspire confidence, and the other thing that it does, I think, is point to uh, the existing systems as rooted in white supremacy, right?
absolutely. Yeah,
These systems that we see it in the prison, maybe on the micro scale, and then in our country, in our nation, at the macro scale. It seems like the cops seem to think those guys get a pass, or even in my home state of Michigan with the anti-lockdown protests, which was all before George Floyd. That was late March,
right.
early April, where they would sit in the Capitol with giant guns or go to
Yeah,
Subway with a gun and be like, I don't need to wear a mask, and I'm doing my First Amendment and my Second Amendment rights, and seeing the cops not really respond to that, and then seeing the kind of the stark contrast in the way that they respond to the biggest civil rights protests in the last 50 years. I
I
think it's
think
kind of telling of the roots of white supremacy in a lot of these systems, like the law enforcement system, the judicial system, and things like that.
I think one of the components of that is well, it's not just that system of white supremacy, but one of the things people need to understand is that police officers and DAs and judges prosecute the crimes that they want to prosecute.
Mm.
And so every prosecution is is built on a police officer's report. So if you want to prosecute police officers, you need to get another police officer to file a report against that man.
Huh.
Because for a prosecutor to put themselves out and just file a prosecution against somebody without the police, that becomes a political decision because they're elected officials in most areas. So
That's incredible. That's really important.
yeah, so like in my particular case, I went to prison based on a fight that I got in one night. Now, from my perspective, I was the victim of multiple crimes, including a property crime. The only reason I was at the place I was at was because I had recently broken my hip in several places and I was recovering from massive surgery. And once again, I was in my addiction because they prescribed me opioids. Now, this is after I'd already gone through recovery and been sober for 4 years. And then I broke my hip, and the moment I was laying on the ground, they injected me with morphine, and I repeated the entire cycle, right? And so at the time, somebody stole my fill, and I went back to retrieve my property. And when I showed up, they told me get off my property. I said, well, I've been in touch with law enforcement my whole life. I'm currently on probation. I should listen to this guy. And so I got off the guy's property and said, I'm going to wait by my car until the person that stole my property comes and returns it, and I'm not leaving until that happens. And so the guy came out and started beating the hell out of me. And then one of his friends came out with a baseball bat and started beating me in the side of the head, and it got really crazy. And somehow I managed to get away from them, and I got in my car, and then I, had a traumatic brain injury, and I don't remember what I did, but apparently I, did donuts on the guy's front yard, and then I rammed his car like 4 or 5 times, you know. Just in a rage, I started committing massive property damage to the guy's property, but they just tried to murder me, so it's like, honestly, I don't remember it happening, but that's apparently where I was at. And when they caught me, I was compliant with the police officers. And that's actually one of the big reasons I've been out on the street lately, because with the Justice for Desmond issue, Desmond Phillips, another person with PTSD, that the cops showed up and he was doing something really mild compared to the situation they found me in. And they just gunned that kid down. They gave me a pass because I think the officer empathized with me because I look like him, But then in that same capacity, he was very friendly with the people at the property, and I'm pretty sure they knew each other previously to that. So when I read the police report, I ended up in the hospital. They took my statement when I was recovering from I was in the hospital in the intensive care unit, and I just received a traumatic brain injury. I was barely conscious. I became unconscious and unresponsive for a matter of hours, and then when I woke up, the cops were right there, and they started questioning me immediately. They used my statement against me, even though I don't remember giving it. They never gave me my Miranda rights, to my knowledge. They didn't technically have me in custody, so they didn't have to. And then when I read the police report, they didn't mention any of my injuries. They didn't take any pictures of the damage that was done to my face, which required reconstructive surgery to put my nose back on because it was hanging off my face. And then, yeah, they didn't mention any of that stuff. They didn't put any pictures of that. The only pictures that showed up in the document were the pictures of the property damage I committed. They included every single person's statement there. But those were all the people that hit me with the baseball bat. And so, none of these things were mentioned. And so that's when I kind of realized, wow, man, the power of the pen is really, really important. And if you have a police officer with an agenda, then you get piss poor police reports and you get poor police work. And like you demonstrated in that other case, their job is not to investigate crimes. Their job is to make money for the county. They pull people over for crimes that they personally witness, charge them fines. They lock people up, charge them fines. They get people on speeding tickets, parking tickets. That's their job. They collect taxes for their department because that's where all the money's going. They're the employees that feed the profitability of the police force. And so, and then they feed those police reports to the DA, who has his own agenda. And there you go, and then the police officers, with the money that they make, their average salary is about $150,000 a year. Well, those guys make campaign contributions. Those guys are the people that get the Chico City Council elected. Those are the guys that get the DA elected and the under DA. Those are the guys that, elect the mayor. So
And the DA without term limits. You told me DA doesn't have term limits. I didn't realize that.
He's been in power as long as I've been aware of politics. As long as I've known what a DA is, Mike Ramsey has been our DA, and I've heard a lot of stories that I can't confirm with evidence, and so I'm not going to say it and put it out there. But as far as I'm concerned, the guy is corrupt and needs to go,
And power consolidates. If you grew up having money, you grew up with your family having money or some amount of power, then that's going to consolidate. And that's one of the arguments against. I see this argument come up every once in a while, like, "Oh, that was 50 years ago. That was 200 years ago. It doesn't really affect people now." But it does, right? Like, if the people who are in power have been in power since, the 70s or the 80s, then they're getting these high salaries. Cops still get pensions. One of the last jobs in the country to get a pension kind of regularly, and then those are their offspring are not the end of they're not the end of that story. They have offspring who might do the same kind of things that they do. Being born into at least a little bit of money, versus the situation, Harrison, that you said you grew up in, which is not any money at all, right? And I think you're doing more to change the system than a lot of they are, or their kids are, right?
Because they have a literally inherent interest in maintaining the system, because that's what provided their quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the battle, is that they have the money, they have the guns, they have their privilege. And if you try and take that away, look at how the police forces across America are reacting to the call to defund their police force. They're brutalizing the populations of almost every city in America, and then they're allowing people that want to brutalize those same people to have a free pass, So if they're not committing the violence on their own with the good wishes of their elected officials, then they're letting people go ahead and do it on their own,
The vigilante justice,
Absolutely.
There's a Michigan militia that's been kind of on and off for a while, or those, which tends to be, for whatever reason, they tend to be groups of conservative white males who are also kind of the most likely to own a gun, right, in the United States. But
well, hey, right here in Chico, the first Justice for Desmond march after George Floyd put up a Black Lives Matter poster and included the Justice for Desmond hashtag on it. And a guy who I used to consider a friend, actually, a guy that I've produced concerts with and worked side by side with for months at a time when I worked at the Tackle Box, put out a call to arms to his friends with concealed carry weapon permits to go downtown and protect the property. And it looks like they want to fight. Well, let's give them one. So bring your guns, literally bring your guns down and protect, the Chico local businesses from Black Lives Matter. And so,
well, and that's the power of narrative right there. I mean, if someone wants a fight, they can paint someone else as being violent, and then they feel justified. Yeah. And that's why that's the beauty of like grassroots organization, solidarity, not charity. You have relationships. That's the closest you can get to the truth of a situation as things change moment by moment.
Yeah. And I mean, luckily, I ended up having a real conversation with the guy and trying to, like, at that point they canceled the event. So I kind of called him and said, hey, you realize that it's not the government taking away their First Amendment right. You are using your Second Amendment right to be the guy that takes away their First Amendment right. That's you. That's not anybody else. That's you by name. And so he was like, oh, I don't mean anything against peaceful protesters. And I was like, well, that's who's going to be down there. And I'm going to be down there with him. So please don't come and murder me, because I'm here. And I know that, we have history. So I was just trying I was trying to use my relationship with the guy to quell things. And so far, we've seen very few incidents of that type of cross violence. And so I don't know if I had anything to do with that, but those conversations are happening and they need to happen, But again, it's a situation where I have that privilege because I'm a white guy that's been in that hick bar and talk to all the people that they're selling guns to. And so I have personal relationships with them. I don't think they knew that I was an undercover liberal in their house, but you know what I mean? But like, that's what it's taking, is literally like, hey man, I'm with them and I care about you too. We should have a conversation. Why don't you talk to the people coordinating this event instead of threatening them with their guns? Like I'm actually considering having that guy, once we get this up and rolling, having that same guy come and talk to me on this podcast, and you know what I mean, inviting some people on the other side of this spectrum, because those conversations need to happen, and they're ugly conversations. They suck. I'm pretty sure I put a target on my back and lost a lot of friends in that situation. I know 5 or 6 people that I was really close with just completely stopped talking to me online. So because they're all a clique. We all went and hung out at their clubhouse. You know what I mean? That type of thing. So that put me on the other side of the political spectrum, and that made me their enemy, and that made them my enemy, which is really unfortunate because,
my conclusion is that because everything's connected, we've bought into the narrative of we are divided. And the truth is that we're all oppressed under the same systems. And it's unfortunately going to take time, which allows for times and action of violence. But our vision is to make health, safety, peace, opportunity for everyone. And that's why we're having these conversations.
For sure.
And people will come around or stuck in their illusions, but we can do our part.
And there's another conversation that I tend to have over and over again is well, if you just did it legally, that would be okay, without any kind of consideration as far as like what that looks like for a lot of people, or if that's possible for some people. Like I was saying earlier with the alt-right groups that are protecting Confederate statues, yeah, knocking down a statue on public property, if it was put up by public funds, that's probably illegal, right? And it's maybe not your definition of a peaceful protest, but it's so easy to forget that our country was founded on destroying property in protest in the Boston Tea Party, and it's literally part of the fabric and the DNA of our country is to do that. And when things are not working for a certain group of people and they don't feel like they really have any kind of recourse, even legally, like go out and vote and fix it, then I think that's when you start seeing the protests that have been going on for now like 4 weeks, right? Or the forced removal of these statues, where a lot of these statues were put up, the Confederate statues put up like in the 60s or not immediately after the Civil War. So and since then there's been legislation in a lot of states that has protected those statues. And like, what do you do if you're a disenfranchised black voter and you have to walk by this statue of a slave owner every single time you go to work downtown or something?
And literally defranchised. They're disenfranchised because when they lock you up, they literally take away your right to a vote. They take away your right to privacy. Your constitutional right to freedom from unreasonable search and seizure goes out the window. When I was on parole, literally every time I had contact with law enforcement, they were mandated to do a full toss of my vehicle, my body. Like, I had to empty out my pockets. They had to go through my entire vehicle every single time so that they could find contraband. And that's that mechanism that you were talking about keeping you in the system and maintaining that, because if they can catch you on something, and even if the cop doesn't want to, it's literally his job description when I find you, I have to do a parole search because that's a part of your terms and conditions. That's my job. And so, I mean, there's this feeling I have, and I don't know if it's actually that popular with a lot of the people in this community, but my perspective is that the cops are being exploited too. They're a workforce that is exploiting these people, but they're being exploited by the owners of society, the corporations, the politicians that have worked on the corporations and the wealthy taxpayers' behalf have set up this system, and they're just a piece of that system. They might be a particularly violent piece of that system, but they're still doing the system's work. And they didn't create that system. They just went and took a job because it only took 6 months at the community college to get that job, and they can make $150,000 as opposed to being a teacher where you're not going to get paid, or it's going to be extremely hard to do so. So
there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of parallels there. Like, you have good intentioned doctors, and yet they may be just doing what they're told to do, and they're prescribing some Norcos, and they're part of the system there. You may have good intentioned folks like from the slums, I'm from Berry Creek and Orville, and I know people that wanted to feel safe and go into law enforcement, and because that's the only option to have something that seems to have integrity, that seems to have some kind of noble official sense and place in society, And it's illusion. You know, we want to have something that feels like it has integrity. We want to be part of something. And right now, our systems being corrupt, you go in with good intentions, but you are just being exploited by the systems for your good intentions.
Correct. Yeah.
And it's important to remember that laws are not morals. I think we think like, oh, the cop enforces the law and that's good. Again, it's that good versus evil, Jedi's versus the Sith kind of mentality that I think we're used to kind of thinking in, like a cop enforces the law and that's a good thing. And you look at LGBTQ plus history. In 1969, it was perfectly legal for a cop to go and raid a gay bar, for example, and arrest people for wearing 3 articles of clothing that didn't match their assigned at birth gender, right? Like if you're a guy wearing high heels in 1969, you could have been arrested for your heels and your skirt and your painted nails. And now RuPaul makes millions of dollars selling that product that previously was illegal, and nothing really morally has changed about it, but the laws have changed. Yeah. And to bring it back to basically the entire conversation, thinking about, well, if it just because it's illegal doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing. And I think there's some cognitive dissonance around that, right? You look at a law and you're like, well, a law is a law for a reason, and people need to enforce it. But then you look at like the DEA and how it enforces its marijuana policy is in direct contradiction with any state that's legalized, right? The DEA lists marijuana as a Schedule 1 drug, which means it's the most dangerous, it's the highest potential for abuse, no medical applications at all for it. And then like the next step down towards safer is like cocaine and ketamine and meth, because some of those do have medical uses. So here's a law you can point to that's pretty clearly in contradiction with what I think everyone knows, which is marijuana is not addictive or harmful, and it does have medical uses, but the DEA has not changed its scheduling of it in decades.
Well, that's because also at a federal level, they literally outlawed doing tests on it and doing studies, and so there was a moratorium on even having medical studies about the medical, so that's how they could maintain that piece of propaganda. But on that subject, I'll say that if you're talking about systemic change, right? California decriminalizing marijuana the same year, that was on the same ballot that people voted for Prop 57. And so overall, 2016, yeah, it was 16, was a pretty big year for California inmates, because the voters of California basically approved every single ballot measure that would allow people to do shorter time in prison, because I think people have realized what our incarceration system is. But they left Prop 57 up to the Board of Parole hearings to make determinations. Well, this is a board that historically votes down 8 out of every 10 parole applications, Like, they try and get their time out of their inmates because they use them for services. And so they're trying to keep you in the system as long as they can, because their system is making an extra $60,000 to $70,000 per year off of that inmate. They need them in their beds. You know what I mean? They look at it as, if you let these people out, we're going to lose our jobs, But that same year, Prop 57 passed. Everybody who was in for a marijuana possession case, just their case just disappeared, and they made it retroactive. So thousands of people got let out overnight because that law passed, because they just decriminalized one thing, whereas they gave all of these services to inmates for different reasons, and that was supposed to be a reform. Prop 57 was supposed to reform the whole system and make it more equitable. Did very, very little, because they left it up to the cops, One was just, you can't prosecute for this anymore. One was, well, they're already prosecuted for this, so we're going to give you some discretion on letting them out early. They just didn't let anybody out. And then over here, they had to, because they no longer were holding them on a crime that was still a crime. And so, yeah, That's a powerful thing. Legalizing drugs, legalizing sex work, um, just a myriad of different things that we prosecute people for because they're illegal. And you hear this saying widespread right now online. Well, if they just didn't commit crime, I think you brought that up, John. And if they just didn't commit a crime, then they wouldn't be dead. If they didn't commit a crime, then the cops wouldn't have beat them down. If they did it legally, then everything would be fine. Well, how about we stop criminalizing so many aspects of the lives of predominantly poor people? If you don't have a house, but you live in a community that outlaws camping, well, that gives a cop a reason to beat the shit out of this guy and throw him in county jail. But if we had housing for those people, which would cost us a hell of a lot less than his medical expenses in the Butte County Jail infirmary, on top of housing him for probably a year that he'll get for resisting arrest or whatever, which is a bullshit charge in the first place. you know that's self-defense as far as I'm concerned. Resisting arrest and self-defense are exactly the same thing. So if you have a right to self-defense, you have a right to resist arrest. you know but when a man's assaulting you, I believe you have a right to defend yourself. I don't care if he's wearing a badge. I don't care if he has a gun. I have a right to lay hands on you if you lay hands on me. Simple as that. But because of that feeling, I'll probably end up back in jail at some point. You know what I mean?
Well, and there's so much incentive on their end to create that situation in the first place, and for me that's the problem. Like, there's incentivization to incite others to violence. So I mentioned I was exposed to grassroots politics at a young age. Well, that was my first time being part of a group where it was publicly discovered that we had an infiltrator. We were in New Orleans, post-Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, lower Ninth Ward. And so I was volunteering with Common Ground Relief. And now a few years later, there's a documentary called Infiltrator by Brandon Darby, who was a white male who said, hey, I'm here. I'm part of your community. I'm here to help this predominantly Black part of the non-tourist area of New Orleans. And Brandon Darby was inciting peaceful volunteers who were there to help distribute food and clothing and to help rebuild homes that were destroyed in the by flood and by hurricane. And he was inciting people to violence. So the cops are trained to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Just different situations, same tactics.
Absolutely.
Which, if you believe that the cops are good, right? That there's this goodness about cops and the job that they do. Hopefully, you start to question that as you hear stories about that or see images of it. As I've seen a lot of on social media over the last 3 and 4 weeks. Hopefully, we start questioning. Is this law good? Is enforcing this law good? Is this serving people? Is this doing what it's supposed to be doing? Or is it creating a different, separate problem entirely, right? Is enforcing anti-marijuana laws, is that doing more harm than good? And probably yes, right?
Absolutely.
Keeping these people incarcerated. Financially, like it works out for the prison system, but that's kind of a snake eating its own tail kind of situation.
It's not just the prison system. It's McDonald's Corporation. It's
Right.
Starbucks. It's any number of makeup companies. It's a lot of different companies that use inmate labor to produce their products.
Right.
And thus make profits. I mean, if you look at it, a corporation in its structure, generally speaking, a for-profit corporation by its corporate charter has a fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders, and that's to maximize profit and minimize costs. Now, if the government has legalized a system of labor that minimizes their costs, then they're beholden to their shareholders to use it.
Mm-hmm.
And the CEO of the corporation can be kicked out of his chair or fired for not working in the best interest of his shareholders. If you look back to the Ford Pinto, there was that whole issue. Well, I took a business law course and they analyzed that, and by all of the documentation of the laws at that time, they considered that what Ford did in a business term was ethical because
Right.
they maximized they held true to their fiduciary responsibility, and if they had pulled that product and redone the whole thing, they would have had a financial loss versus just settling the claims. We
Yeah.
settle out of court and it's only 1 per 1,000 deaths, of consumers, so we make a profit on the car. We issue them $50,000, for their dead loved one, which is reminiscent of what just happened in Butte County Court with PG&E. You know, like, and think about this, right? Even the judge in that case, which by coincidence is the same judge that sentenced me, Judge Deems, Michael Deems, that guy gave me 5 years in state prison for damaging a man's car and his white picket fence and scaring them. So they considered it an assault with a deadly weapon because I applied the threat of force and did property damage. So they considered it assault with a deadly weapon. I did 2 years in state prison. I was sentenced to 5 with half. They killed 84 people through their criminal negligence, but because of the structure of a corporation, they're shielded from liability personally. The corporation can speak as a person, but it can't be tried as a person because it's not a person. And so there's no personal liability for the negligence. And even Mike Ramsey and Judge Deems pointed out that they gave them the maximum fine under California law. So it's not an issue that Mike Ramsey just didn't go full bore. He did, and like I don't support that man at all. But
yeah, but it sounds good. It sounds like he did the best he could, and yeah, what was that option?
Well, and here's the thing: he's going to run on that. He's going to use that to get reelected because in this climate, somebody's definitely going to run against him. But he's gonna use the PG&E prosecution as that. But then the judge said, hey, if you were just a person, if you were an actual person, you'd be getting 90 years in state prison right now. I send people to prison every single day, and that man does, believe me. Like I've been in his courtroom. I'll spend an hour in his courtroom, and he'll send 4 people to state prison, give another 5 or 6 probation, which puts them basically out on the street, but in a position where they're funding the police by paying fines, paying their supervision fees, and all of these things. And then they have you on the snare so that every time they find you, they can search your entire property. If you don't do your community service, if you don't do this program, that program, then they can lock you up and feed you into the system, right? That man, his entire job all day, every day is to lock people up, and he wanted to. Because that's what he does. He said, I would have given you 90 years in state prison if I could have. But this is California state law. That's the law of our land. He gave them the maximum fine he possibly could under state law. So what does that tell you about the way California runs corporate law? And what does that tell you about who pays for the campaigns of our elected officials in this state? That they wrote a law that 84 people in our community can die in a fire, that your friend Julian even pointed out, before the shit happened, that it was going to happen. A lot of people in this community, man, I worked for Terra Fuego, which is a land management company that works underneath not Cal Fire, that works underneath Firestorm. And what we did was go up into Forest Ranch and got the land ready for controlled burns. Well, it took us 4 months to do 1 10-acre piece of property, to clear enough brush, limb the trees up to a certain level, cut fire line across the area of the hill, like, why don't we have a massive jobs program to do controlled burns? Why don't we have the Machuca tribe that did that for 10,000 years in this valley, handling these things, this type of stuff. But then this fire happens that a lot of people saw coming and that a lot of people said we could have avoided. And the best we can do is get $40,000 per citizen. And that's not going to go to the actual people. They all had to file lawsuits for themselves. The actual families of the victims had to go do their own due diligence in order to get insurance claims and to get lawsuits filed with PG&E. This is just money for the county. This is fines. This is going into that general fund that's going to feed $27 million into the Chico PD or $50 million into Butte County Jail. So,
and I think as Californians and Americans, we have to look at our laws and the way that they're enforced and the message that they sent. Kate mentioned the word earlier, incentivize, and I think that's really important. To think about what is the incentive for one group or another, and I think we have to look at our laws and think about them and think, who is this serving? What is the purpose of this law? Why are we enforcing it? Why are we enforcing it the way that we do? Think about the case of the 84 lives lost from PG&E and what they get is fines rather than prison time. Who does a law like that serve really? I think that's something we have to question and kind of look at, especially as we're post-pandemic world and a post kind of a neo-civil rights kind of era as of like 2014. I'm thinking Ferguson through today and through the future. Looking at all these things that are laws and thinking, why is that a law? And could we change it? And who's it serving? And what is the purpose of this?
Well, and another thing I've been thinking about lately is why don't we as a population get to vote on more of these? Why is it like, maybe I'm a little bit radical, but like I believe I took a hold of the Occupy movement's, push towards direct democracy. And yeah, it was clunky. It was messed up. There was a group of people waving their hands like this to make votes. But there was just a general council in that community, and they voted on the laws that they wanted. They voted on the way they were going to police their little area. They voted on these things so that the people that were actually involved had a personal say and a personal stake, and they could see with their own eyes how that process happened. You know what I mean? I don't know what that looks like writ large because America is a huge country, but at least on a local level, we're right here in Butte County. The city building is in the plaza right across the street, We have police enforcement handling the homeless situation when we have an entire community of homeless people living in the plaza right across the street. But their priority is to fund the police at $27 million so that they can control those people as opposed to just funding a homeless shelter that would give those people a place to live. Why? Because they're drug addicts, because they drink. And you have to deserve government services in our society. You have to be worthy of it. If you do drugs, well, that's a criminal. If you've ever stolen anything in your life, that's a criminal. If you have a drug conviction from, 1980, well, you're a criminal. So, you know what I mean? So if you make it on this list, if you make it on that list, then you're not provided services in our community because we have this moralistic society that's based on puritanical ideas from the 18th century, so why with all of our technology? We're all on Facebook all day, every day right now. Why isn't there a social media platform for the legal system where we can all actually make votes? You know what I mean? Why are we stuck in every 4-year system nationally and every 2-year system locally where we get to make some votes mostly on who's going to represent us? Those are people that are corruptible. Those are people that are writing on campaigns funded by, wealthy donors who have a vested interest in the system we already have. Mm-hmm. So the idea of representative democracy is failing us at every stage of our system, from local city council all the way up to Congress and the presidency. But we still haven't figured out a better system than what the guys 250 years ago came up with.
Well, I'm pretty confident that we're going to use this platform to explore the ideas, because there are a lot of models that could come to fruition, but we haven't explored them. We don't have the general enough critical mass behind them. I know I didn't say anything before we started recording, but I might need to sign off soon. So I just wanted to check in before I have to.
We got 5 minutes before the scheduled meeting is over, so I think it's going to dump us in 5 minutes anyway. So let's wrap this up. I don't know. This has been an amazing conversation. I don't know about you guys, but I think this went like way better than I expected it to. So
Good.
I don't know. This is good.